The chains around her wrists had worn grooves so deep they would never fully heal. 12-year-old Sarah Mitchell crouched in the corner of the barn, her hollow eyes reflecting a pain that went far beyond physical hunger. She had been nothing more than property for 3 years, sold and traded like livestock across the brutal frontier settlements of 1847 Texas. But on this scorching August morning, everything would change when a wounded Comanche war chief named Thomas Whitehorse would see something in her that no one else had ever recognized, a power that would transform not just her life, but the destiny of 2 peoples caught between war and peace. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun blazed mercilessly through the gaps in the barn's rotting boards, casting prison bar shadows across Sarah Mitchell's emaciated form. At 12 years old, she had already learned that survival meant making herself invisible, curling into corners where angry boots couldn't reach, staying silent when the hunger gnawed at her stomach like a living thing. The iron shackles around her ankles clinked softly as she shifted position, a sound that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. 3 years had passed since the cholera outbreak that claimed her parents and baby brother, leaving her alone in a world that viewed orphaned children as burdens to be discarded or commodities to be exploited. Sarah could barely remember her mother's face now, but she could still recall the warmth of her father's hands as he carved wooden toys by candlelight. Those memories felt like stories from someone else's life, fairy tales that belonged to a girl who had never known the taste of moldy bread or the sting of a leather strap across her shoulders. The barn door creaked open, and Sarah instinctively pressed herself deeper into the shadows. Heavy footsteps approached, accompanied by the wheeze of labored breathing that meant Jacob Morrison was having another one of his coughing fits. The tuberculosis was killing him slowly, but not slowly enough for Sarah's liking. Morrison had purchased her from a traveling preacher who claimed to be running an orphanage, though Sarah had quickly learned that the man's definition of charity involved selling children to anyone willing to pay for unpaid labor. "Get up, girl," Morrison growled, his voice thick with phlegm. "Got someone wants to look at you." Sarah's blood turned to ice. Being looked at meant being evaluated, measured, appraised like a horse or a piece of farm equipment. It meant the possibility of being sold again, of starting over with new masters who might be even worse than Morrison. She had learned to dread these inspections, when potential buyers would examine her teeth, squeeze her arms to test her strength, and discuss her value as if she weren't standing right there listening to every word. She struggled to her feet, her legs trembling from weakness and fear. Morrison had been feeding her even less than usual lately, claiming that food was too expensive to waste on worthless mouths. Sarah suspected he was simply trying to save money before getting rid of her, the same way he might starve a horse before selling it to hide its true condition until after the transaction was complete. "Clean yourself up," Morrison commanded, tossing her a damp rag that smelled of stale water and mildew. "And don't say nothing unless you're spoken to directly. This buyer's different from the others." Sarah wiped the grime from her face with the filthy cloth, wondering what Morrison meant by different. In her experience, all the men who came to buy children were the same hard-faced settlers who saw her as nothing more than a tool to be used until she broke. She had survived 3 different masters in as many years, each one convinced that regular beatings and minimal food would transform her into a grateful, hard-working servant. The barn door opened wider, and Morrison emerged into the blazing sunlight, dragging Sarah behind him by the chain that connected her ankle shackles. The metal was hot enough to burn her skin, but she had learned long ago not to cry out in pain. Tears only made the beatings worse. What she saw in Morrison's yard made her stop so suddenly that the chain jerked tight around her ankles. A man, unlike any she had ever encountered, sat mounted on a magnificent paint horse, his presence commanding attention despite the obvious pain he was trying to conceal. His weathered face bore the distinctive features of the Comanche people: high cheekbones, dark eyes that seemed to see everything, and an expression of quiet dignity that radiated strength even in obvious suffering. Blood seeped through the crude bandages wrapped around his left shoulder, and Sarah could see the way he held himself slightly hunched, protecting what was clearly a serious wound. His long black hair was streaked with silver and braided with feathers and small bones that caught the sunlight as he moved. Despite his injuries, he sat the horse with the natural grace of someone who had been born to ride. This was Thomas Whitehorse, though Sarah didn't know his name yet. What she could sense, even from a distance, was something that made her breath catch in her throat. Unlike every other adult she had encountered since her parents' death, this man's eyes held no cruelty, no calculation, no dismissive indifference. When his gaze fell on her, she felt as though he was seeing her, not evaluating her usefulness or planning how to exploit her, but actually seeing Sarah Mitchell, the frightened child beneath the layers of abuse and neglect. "This is the girl I told you about," Morrison said, his voice taking on the false friendliness he used when trying to make a sale. 12 years old, good worker, doesn't give no trouble. Been training her myself for the past year." Thomas's eyes narrowed at the word training, and Sarah noticed his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. His gaze traveled from her shackled ankles to her hollow cheeks, taking in the evidence of systematic starvation and abuse with the careful attention of someone who understood suffering intimately. "Remove the chains," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying an authority that made Morrison shift nervously. "Now see here," Morrison blustered. "Them chains are for everyone's safety. Girl's got a wild streak, needs to know her place. Take them off and she might try to run." Thomas dismounted from his horse with careful, controlled movements that suggested his injuries were more serious than he was letting on. As he approached, Sarah caught the scent of sage and leather and something that reminded her of the wild places beyond the settlements, of freedom and open sky. Despite her terror, she found herself straightening slightly, lifting her chin in a gesture of defiance she hadn't felt in years. "I said remove the chains," Thomas repeated, and this time his voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone who was not accustomed to having his orders questioned. "Now," Morrison fumbled for the key, his hand shaking as he unlocked the shackles. The moment the metal fell away from her ankles, Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, not hope exactly, but the absence of the crushing weight that had been her constant companion for so long. She rubbed her raw ankles, feeling the circulation. Slowly returned to her feet. Thomas knelt down so that he was at eye level with her, a gesture that shocked Sarah so completely she nearly stepped backward. In her experience, adults never lowered themselves to a child's level unless they were preparing to strike. But Thomas's movements were gentle, deliberate, respectful in a way that made her throat tight with emotion she couldn't name. "What is your name, little one?" he asked, his voice soft and surprisingly warm. Sarah's voice came out as barely a whisper, rusty from disuse. "Sarah Mitchell, sir." "Sarah Mitchell," Thomas repeated, as if testing the weight of the name. "That is a good name, a strong name. Tell me, Sarah Mitchell, how long have you been with this man?" The question was asked so gently that Sarah found herself answering before she could think to be afraid. "Near on a year, sir. Maybe more. Time gets mixed up." Thomas nodded as if he understood exactly what she meant by time getting mixed up. "And before him?" "Different places," Sarah said, her voice growing slightly stronger. "Different masters." The words seemed to hit Thomas like a physical blow. His jaw clenched, and for a moment, Sarah glimpsed something fierce and dangerous in his dark eyes. But when he spoke again, his voice remained calm and controlled. "How much?" he asked Morrison. Without looking away from Sarah, Morrison's face lit up with greedy satisfaction. "Well, now she's a valuable piece of property. Been considerable investment in her training, and—" "How much?" Thomas interrupted, his voice cutting through Morrison's sales pitch like a blade. $200, Morrison said quickly, clearly, naming a price he thought was too high to be accepted. Thomas reached into a leather pouch and counted out gold coins without hesitation, placing them in Morrison's outstretched palm. The transaction was completed so quickly that Sarah felt dizzy with the sudden change in her circumstances. One moment she was chained property, the next she was what? She didn't dare hope that her situation had actually improved. Get your things, Thomas told her gently. Sarah looked up at him with confusion. I don't have things, sir. Just just what I'm wearing. The pain that flickered across Thomas's face was quickly suppressed, but Sarah caught it. He stood slowly, his hand pressed against his wounded shoulder, and turned to Morrison with an expression that made the settler take an involuntary step backward. If I discover that you have harmed this child beyond what I can already see, Thomas said, his voice deadly quiet, I will return. And when I return, you will learn exactly what the Comanche do to men who torture children. Morrison's face went pale, and he began to stammer something about legal ownership and proper treatment, but Thomas had already turned away. He lifted Sarah onto his horse with surprising gentleness, settling her in front of him so that she was protected by his arms as he took the reins. As they rode away from Morrison's farm, Sarah felt the man's presence behind her like a shield against the harsh world she had known. Thomas's body radiated warmth and strength, and despite his injuries, she felt safer than she had in 3 years. The steady rhythm of the horse's gait was soothing, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Sarah allowed herself to relax slightly. Where are we going? She asked after they had ridden in silence for nearly an hour. Home, Thomas replied simply. We are going home. Sarah had no idea what that word meant anymore, but something in the way Thomas said it made her believe that perhaps she was about to find out. Behind them, the smoke from Morrison's farm disappeared into the distance, and ahead lay the vast expanse of the Texas plains, stretching endlessly toward a horizon that suddenly seemed full of possibilities rather than threats. As they rode, Sarah became aware of something strange happening within her own body. The constant ache in her stomach was fading, replaced by a warmth that seemed to spread from her chest outward. Her breathing came easier, and the weakness that had plagued her for months was lifting like morning mist. She didn't understand what was happening to her, but for the first time in 3 years, Sarah Mitchell felt truly alive. Thomas guided the horse toward a distant line of trees that marked the beginning of Comanche territory, and as they traveled, Sarah began to sense that her life was about to change in ways she couldn't possibly imagine. The wounded war chief who had purchased her freedom carried secrets as deep as his scars, and somewhere in the wilderness ahead waited a destiny that would transform not just her understanding of herself, but her very nature. The sun climbed higher as they rode toward whatever lay beyond the horizon, and Sarah Mitchell, no longer a piece of property, no longer a burden to be discarded, began the journey toward discovering who she was truly meant to become. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Comanche camp appeared like a mirage shimmering in the afternoon heat, materializing from the grasslands as if it had always been there, waiting. Sarah pressed closer to Thomas as they approached, her heart hammering against her ribs at the sight of the circular arrangement of buffalo hide teepees, each one decorated with symbols and paintings that seemed to tell stories she couldn't understand. Smoke rose from cooking fires, and the sound of voices speaking in a language that flowed like water over stones filled the air. This was a world utterly different from the harsh wooden structures and barren farmyards of the settlements. Here, children ran freely between the lodges, their laughter bright and uninhibited. Women moved with quiet efficiency, tending fires and preparing meals while keeping watchful eyes on their young ones. Men sat in circles, some crafting weapons or tools, others engaged in animated discussions, that involved elaborate hand gestures and occasional bursts of laughter. What struck Sarah most profoundly was the absence of the tension that had permeated every settlement she'd known. No one here moved with the hunched shoulders of the perpetually fearful. No one flinched at unexpected sounds or kept their eyes downcast to avoid unwanted attention. These people moved with the confidence of those who belonged exactly where they were. "My people," Thomas said softly, his voice carrying a warmth that made Sarah's chest tight. "The Numunu, what your people call Comanche." As they entered the camp, Sarah became aware of the attention they were attracting. Conversations paused as people noticed Thomas's return, and she could see the immediate concern in their faces when they spotted the blood seeping through his bandages. But what surprised her was the way their gazes lingered on her, not with the calculating assessment she was used to, but with genuine curiosity and something that might have been compassion. An elderly woman emerged from one of the larger teepees, her silver hair braided with colorful beads and her weathered face creased with lines that spoke of a lifetime of both joy and sorrow. She moved with the careful dignity of advanced age, but her dark eyes were sharp and penetrating as they took in Thomas's condition and the small girl riding with him. "Thomas Whitehorse," she said, her English heavily accented but clear, "you return to us wounded and carrying burdens that are not your own." Thomas dismounted carefully, his movements betraying the extent of his injuries. "Grandmother Mary," he said with deep respect, using the English translation of her name. "I bring home more than wounds. I bring hope." The old woman's eyes shifted to Sarah, studying her with an intensity that made the girl want to disappear. But instead of the harsh judgment she expected, she saw something that made her breath catch recognition, as if the stranger somehow knew her. "This child has been touched by great suffering," Grandmother Mary said, approaching slowly, "but also by great power. I can smell it on her like sage smoke." Sarah didn't understand what the old woman meant, but she felt compelled to slide down from the horse and stand before her. Up close, she could see that Grandmother Mary's eyes held depths that seemed to contain the wisdom of countless generations. "What is your name, little one?" Grandmother Mary asked, her voice surprisingly gentle. "Sarah Mitchell, ma'am, Sarah," whispered, falling back on the polite responses that had sometimes saved her from beatings. "Sarah Mitchell," the old woman repeated, tasting the foreign syllables. "A white name for a child who carries the old blood. Interesting." She reached out and touched Sarah's forehead with fingers that felt electric against her skin. "You have been searching for her without knowing it, haven't you, Thomas?" Thomas moved to stand beside Sarah, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. "The spirits spoke to me in dreams during my healing. They showed me a child who would bridge two worlds, who would carry the gift of healing between our peoples. When I saw her—" "When you saw her, you knew," Grandmother Mary finished. "The ancestors have been whispering of her coming for many seasons. The girl who would learn the old ways and teach them back to a world that has forgotten how to heal." Sarah looked between the two adults, understanding nothing of what they were discussing, but sensing that it concerned her in ways that were both thrilling and terrifying. "I don't understand," she said, her voice small but steady. "I don't know anything about healing or old ways or any of it." Grandmother Mary smiled, and the expression transformed her entire face. "Of course you don't, child. Knowing comes with learning, and learning comes with time. But first, you must heal yourself before you can heal others." She turned to address several women who had gathered nearby, speaking rapidly in Comanche. Sarah caught the rhythm of the language, noting how different it sounded from the harsh, clipped English of the settlements. This language seemed to flow like music, rising and falling in patterns that felt almost familiar. "Blue Sky Woman will prepare a lodge for you," Grandmother Mary told Sarah. "And Morning Star will tend to your immediate needs. You are thin as a winter branch, child. We must feed your body before we can begin to feed your spirit." The woman called Blue Sky Woman stepped forward, her face kind and welcoming. She appeared to be in her 30s, with the strong build of someone accustomed to physical labor, but without the beaten-down look Sarah had seen in so many settlement women. Her doeskin dress was decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the light as she moved. "Come, little sister," Blue Sky Woman said in careful English. "Let us make you comfortable." As they prepared to leave, Sarah felt a moment of panic. Thomas was the only connection she had to safety, the only person who had shown her genuine kindness in years. The thought of being separated from him, even temporarily, made her chest tighten with fear. "I will not be far," Thomas assured her, somehow, reading her distress. "I must allow the medicine women to tend to my wounds, but I will check on you before the sun sets. You are safe here, Sarah Mitchell. These people will protect you as they would protect their own children." The teepee that Blue Sky Woman led her to was smaller than the others but beautifully appointed. The hide walls were painted with symbols that seemed to move in the flickering light from the central fire pit. Soft buffalo robes were arranged around the edges, and the entire space felt warm and welcoming in a way that no building ever had. "Sit," Blue Sky Woman said, gesturing to a pile of furs near the fire. "We will clean you and feed you, and then you can rest. Tomorrow the real work begins." The process of being cared for was so foreign to Sarah that she nearly wept from the overwhelming sensation of gentle hands and genuine concern. Blue Sky Woman heated water in a large pot, adding herbs that filled the air with soothing scents. She bathed Sarah with the careful attention of a mother tending to a beloved child, washing away years of grime and neglect, as the warm water and soft cloths worked their magic. Sarah felt layers of tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying begin to dissolve. The constant hypervigilance that had kept her alive in the settlements started to fade, replaced by a sense of security she couldn't remember ever experiencing. "Your hair," Blue Sky Woman murmured as she combed through Sarah's tangled locks. "It is the color of autumn grass, very beautiful. And your eyes, they are like the sky before a storm. You have been marked by the spirits, little one. I can feel it in your bones." Sarah wanted to protest that she was nothing special, just a discarded orphan who had survived through luck and stubborn refusal to die. But something in Blue Sky Woman's touch made her feel as though perhaps she was wrong about herself. Maybe there was more to Sarah Mitchell than she had ever imagined. The food that followed was unlike anything Sarah had eaten in years, not just because it was plentiful and fresh, but because it was prepared with care and offered with love. Blue Sky Woman served her buffalo stew thick with vegetables, corn cakes sweetened with honey, and a tea made from herbs that seemed to warm her from the inside out. "Eat slowly," Blue Sky Woman warned with a smile. "Your stomach has forgotten how to handle real food. We must teach it to remember." As Sarah ate, she became aware of sounds from outside the teepee, the gentle murmur of evening conversations, the laughter of children, the soft nickering of horses. It was the sound of a community at peace with itself, of people who belonged to each other and to the land they inhabited. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Sarah asked suddenly, the question escaping before she could stop it. Blue Sky Woman paused. In her work of organizing Sarah's new clothes, a simple doeskin dress decorated with small shells and beads. "Because you are here," she said simply. "Because Thomas Whitehorse brought you to us. Because the spirits have chosen you for something important. But mostly because you are a child who has been hurt, and healing hurt children is what mothers do." The word mother hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had almost forgotten what it meant to have someone care for her well-being without expecting anything in return. The concept of unconditional kindness was so foreign that she didn't know how to respond to it. "I'm not your child," she whispered, afraid that claiming too much might make this kindness disappear. "No," Blue Sky Woman agreed gently. "You are not born from my body. But you are here, in my lodge, under my protection. That makes you my responsibility, my privilege to care for. In the way of our people, that makes you family. Family, another word that had lost its meaning in the harsh years since Sarah's parents died. But sitting in this warm lodge, wearing clean clothes and feeling properly fed for the first time in months, she began to understand that family might be something that could be chosen rather than just something you were born into. That night, as she lay on the soft buffalo robes with her stomach full and her body clean, Sarah felt something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. Not the desperate hope of survival that had kept her alive in the settlements, but something deeper and more profound. The hope that perhaps her life could be more than just endurance, that perhaps she could be more than just a victim of circumstances beyond her control. Outside the teepee, she could hear the sounds of the camp settling into sleep. A night bird called from somewhere in the darkness, and the wind whispered through the grass with a sound like distant music. For the first time in 3 years, Sarah Mitchell fell asleep without fear, surrounded by the warmth and protection of people who had chosen to claim her as their own. As she drifted off, she thought she heard voices calling to her from very far away, not threatening or commanding, but welcoming, inviting her to remember something she had never learned, but somehow knew. The voices spoke in a language she didn't recognize but understood perfectly, and they told her that tomorrow would bring the beginning of discoveries that would change not just her life, but the lives of everyone she would touch. The healing had begun, though Sarah didn't yet realize that the warmth spreading through her chest was more than just gratitude. It was power, ancient and profound, stirring to life. After lying dormant for generations, the scared little girl who had been chained in a barn was beginning to transform into something the world had never seen before: a bridge between two peoples. A healer who would carry the sacred knowledge of the Comanche into a world that desperately needed to remember what it meant to be whole. Dawn broke over the Comanche camp with the soft whisper of wind through grass and the distant call of meadowlarks greeting the sun. Sarah woke to sounds she had never heard before, not the harsh clanging of settlement bells or the angry shouts of men beginning their day, but the gentle murmur of a community stirring to life in harmony with the natural world. She lay still for a moment, disoriented by the absence of chains around her ankles and the softness of the buffalo robes beneath her body. The events of the previous day felt almost dreamlike: the rescue from Morrison's farm, the ride across the plains, the incredible kindness of strangers who had welcomed her as family. Part of her wondered if she would wake to find herself back in the barn, discovering that hope had been nothing more than a cruel dream. But the warmth of the morning fire and the scent of sage burning in the teepee center confirmed that this new reality was genuine. Through the hide walls, she could hear Blue Sky Woman moving around outside, speaking quietly to someone in the flowing cadences of the Comanche language. "Sarah?" Blue Sky Woman called softly. "Are you awake, little sister?" "Yes, ma'am," Sarah replied, sitting up and running her hands through her clean hair. Even that simple gesture felt foreign after years of matted, filthy tangles. Blue Sky Woman entered the teepee carrying a wooden bowl filled with steaming porridge, made from corn and buffalo meat. The smell alone made Sarah's stomach growl with hunger, but it was a different kind of hunger than the desperate gnawing she had known for so long. This was the healthy appetite of a body that expected to be fed, that trusted food would come regularly. "Eat," Blue Sky Woman said with a smile, settling beside Sarah near the fire. "Today you begin to learn about the gifts the spirits have given you. But first, you must have strength." As Sarah ate the nourishing breakfast, she became aware of unusual sensations coursing through her body. Her fingers tingled with warmth that seemed to emanate from within her bones. Colors appeared more vivid. The orange flames of the fire seemed to dance with living light, and the painted symbols on the teepee walls pulsed with meaning she couldn't quite grasp, but somehow felt. "Something's happening to me," Sarah whispered, setting down her bowl with trembling hands. "I feel different." Blue Sky Woman's expression grew serious as she reached out to touch Sarah's forehead. "The healing power is awakening," she said. Quietly, Grandmother Mary said it would begin once you felt safe enough to lower your guard. The spirits have been waiting for you to trust them. Before Sarah could ask what that meant, the teepee flap opened and Thomas entered, moving slowly, but with obvious improvement from the previous day. His shoulder was freshly bandaged, and though pain still creased his features, there was a vitality in his eyes that spoke of healing taking place. "How do you feel this morning, Sarah?" he asked, settling cross-legged near the fire with careful movements. "Strange," Sarah admitted. "Like there's electricity running through my hands and everything looks more real than it did yesterday." Thomas and Blue Sky Woman exchanged meaningful glances. "Show me your hands," Thomas said gently. Sarah extended her palms toward him, and both adults drew sharp breaths. Her hands were glowing with a soft, warm light that seemed to emanate from beneath her skin. The glow was subtle but unmistakable, like captured moonlight trying to escape. "The sacred fire," Blue Sky Woman whispered in awe. "It has been over 100 years since anyone in our tribe has carried the healing light." Thomas leaned forward, his voice filled with reverence. "Sarah, do you remember your grandmother? Your mother's mother?" Sarah frowned, trying to reach back through memories clouded by trauma and time, a little. "She had gentle hands and sang songs I didn't understand. She died when I was very small. What was her name?" Thomas pressed gently. "Rebecca White." "No, White Dove, Rebecca White Dove. Mama said she was different from other people, that she could help sick animals get better just by touching them. But Mama also said I shouldn't tell anyone about that, because people wouldn't understand." Thomas's eyes widened with recognition. White Dove was Comanche. She was taken as a child during a raid, adopted by settlers who changed her name and forbade her from speaking of her heritage. But the blood remembers, Sarah. The power passes through the generations, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The revelation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She stared at her glowing hands, beginning to understand that everything she had believed about herself was incomplete. "I'm part Comanche?" "Your grandmother was full-blood Numunu," Thomas confirmed. "Stolen from our people when she was younger than you are now. The healing gift runs in her family line, your family line. That is why the spirits led me to you, why they showed me your face in my dreams." Sarah felt the world spinning around her as pieces of her identity rearranged themselves into patterns she had never imagined. The strange familiarity she had felt with the Comanche language, the immediate sense of belonging in the camp, the way Grandmother Mary had looked at her with recognition, it all made sense now. "But I don't know how to heal anyone," Sarah protested, fear creeping into her voice. "I don't know anything about medicine or spirits or any of it." "Learning begins with willingness," said a new voice from the teepee entrance. Grandmother Mary stepped inside, her ancient eyes bright with purpose. "And willingness begins with trust. Do you trust us, child?" Sarah looked around at the three faces surrounding her. Thomas, who had risked his life to save her from slavery. Blue Sky Woman, who had cared for her with maternal tenderness. And Grandmother Mary, whose wisdom seemed to encompass generations of knowledge. For the first time in her life, she realized she was surrounded by people who wanted nothing from her except the chance to help her become who she was meant to be. "Yes," she said quietly, "I trust you." Grandmother Mary smiled and produced a small bundle wrapped in soft leather. "Then we begin. But first, you must understand what you are accepting. The healing gift is not just a blessing, it is a responsibility. Those who carry it must be willing to bear the pain of others, to sacrifice their own comfort for the good of the community. Are you prepared for that burden?" Sarah thought of the years of suffering she had endured, the way pain had been her constant companion. "I already know what it feels like to hurt," she said simply. "If I can use that knowledge to help others hurt less, then I want to learn." The old woman unwrapped the bundle, revealing a collection of items that seemed to hum with their own energy. There were small pouches of herbs, crystals that caught and held the light, carved bone implements, and feathers from birds Sarah couldn't identify. At the center of the collection lay a necklace made from silver and turquoise, its pendant shaped like a stylized hand with healing symbols etched into the metal. "This belonged to your grandmother," Grandmother Mary said, lifting the necklace carefully. "She wore it when she worked the healing magic, before she was taken from us. It has been waiting for you to claim it." As the necklace settled around Sarah's neck, she felt a jolt of energy that made her gasp. The pendant grew warm against her chest, and suddenly she could see threads of light connecting every living thing in the teepee. Thomas's injury appeared as a dark tangle of pain and inflammation, while Blue Sky Woman's body showed the healthy flow of life force moving through her. Grandmother Mary's ancient form revealed itself as a repository of accumulated wisdom, her spirit shining like a beacon. "I can see it," Sarah whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "I can see the energy in everything. Now you begin to understand," Grandmother Mary said with satisfaction. "The healing sight is the first gift to awaken. With it, you can see not just what is wrong, but what needs to be made right." Thomas shifted uncomfortably, his hand moving to his wounded shoulder. "The pain has been getting worse since yesterday," he admitted. "I think infection may be setting in." Without thinking, Sarah reached out and placed her glowing hands on his bandaged shoulder. The moment her fingers made contact, she felt his pain as if it were her own, a burning, throbbing agony that made her bite her lip to keep from crying out. But underneath the pain, she sensed something else, the potential for healing, the body's desperate desire to repair itself. Heat flowed from her hands into Thomas's injury, and she watched in amazement as the dark tangles of infection began to dissolve. The fever that had been building in his system cooled, and the torn tissues started to knit themselves back together with impossible speed. Thomas's eyes widened as the constant ache that had plagued him for days simply vanished. He moved his shoulder experimentally, then with growing amazement as he realized the wound was completely healed. Where there had been torn flesh and seeping infection, now there was only healthy, unmarked skin. "The ancestors have returned to us," Grandmother Mary breathed, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "The healing gift lives again." Sarah pulled her hands back, staring at them in shock. The glow was fading now, but she could still feel the power humming beneath her skin like a living thing. "I did that?" "You did that," Thomas confirmed, his voice filled with awe. "You have just performed a healing that would have taken weeks of traditional medicine, if it had been possible at all." Blue Sky Woman reached out and took Sarah's hands in hers, examining them with wonder. "The spirits have chosen well," she said softly. "But child, you must understand this gift comes with great responsibility. There will be many who seek your help, and you must learn to balance your power with wisdom." Sarah felt the weight of expectation settling on her shoulders, like a heavy blanket. Part of her wanted to run away from this destiny, to remain the simple orphan girl who asked nothing of the world except to be left alone. But another part of her, the part that had always known she was different, that had always felt there, was something more to her existence, embraced the possibility of purpose. "What happens now?" she asked, looking between the three adults who had become her guides into this new world. "Now you learn," Grandmother Mary said firmly. "You will study the old ways, the plant medicines, the sacred ceremonies. You will practice channeling your gift until it becomes as natural as breathing. And you will prepare yourself for the day when the spirits call you to use your power in ways that will change the fate of both our peoples." As if summoned by her words, the sound of approaching horses reached their ears. Through the teepee walls, they could hear voices calling out in alarm, speaking rapidly in Comanche. Thomas rose quickly, his newly healed shoulder moving without pain, and stepped outside to investigate. He returned moments later with a grim expression. "Riders approaching from the east," he reported. "Settlement men, armed and riding hard." They appear to be searching for something. Sarah's blood turned to ice as she realized what or who they were probably seeking. "They're looking for me," she whispered. "Morrison must have told them about the sale. They've come to take me back." Thomas's jaw tightened with determination. "No one will take you from us," he said firmly. "You are under the protection of the Numunu now. You are family." But even as he spoke, Sarah could see the concern in his eyes. The healing gift that had just awakened in her was precious beyond measure, but it had also made her a target. The settlers would not understand or respect the sacred power she carried. They would see only a valuable piece of property that had been stolen from them. Outside, the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and Sarah realized that her journey toward understanding her true nature was about to face its first real test. The power that flowed through her hands might be enough to heal wounds, but could it protect her from the hatred and ignorance of those who would never accept what she was becoming? The morning sun climbed higher over the plains, and Sarah Mitchell, granddaughter of White Dove, carrier of the ancient healing gift, prepared to discover whether the sacred power awakening within her was strong enough to defend not just her own freedom, but the future of two peoples learning to trust each other in a world that seemed determined to keep them apart. The dust cloud on the horizon grew larger as the armed settlers approached, their intentions clear in the aggressive way they rode. Sarah watched from the teepee entrance as Thomas gathered the warriors of the camp, their faces grim with the knowledge that peaceful coexistence was about to be tested by men who understood only force and ownership. "How many?" Grandmother Mary asked, her ancient voice steady despite the approaching danger. 12 riders, Thomas replied, checking his rifle with practiced efficiency. "Led by a man I recognize, Captain William Sherman, the territorial marshal. Morrison must have convinced him that I stole valuable property." Sarah's heart sank as she realized her presence was about to bring violence to the people who had shown her nothing but kindness. "I should go with them," she said quietly. "I won't let you fight because of me." "No." The word came from Blue Sky Woman with such fierce determination that Sarah stepped back in surprise. "You belong with us now. The spirits have chosen your path, and we will not let ignorant men destroy what the ancestors have ordained." Thomas placed a protective hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You are not property to be bought and sold," he said firmly. "You are family, and we protect our family." The sound of hoofbeats grew thunderous as the riders approached the camp's perimeter. Sarah could see them now, hard-faced men in dusty clothes, their hands resting on their weapons with the casual confidence of those who had never been denied anything they wanted. At their head rode a tall man with steel-gray hair and cold eyes, his marshal's badge glinting in the morning sun. Captain Sherman raised his hand, and the riders came to a halt just outside the camp. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the nervous snorting of horses and the whisper of wind through the grass. "Thomas Whitehorse," Sherman called out, his voice carrying across the distance between them. "I'm here on official business. You're harboring stolen property that belongs to Jacob Morrison." Thomas stepped forward, his warriors flanking him in a display of unified strength. "I am Thomas Whitehorse, war chief of the Numunu. I have stolen nothing. I purchased a child from a man who was mistreating her, and I have given her a home where she belongs." Sherman's face hardened. "That girl is legally bound to Morrison. The territorial government doesn't recognize your authority to interfere with lawful contracts." "The territorial government doesn't recognize our authority to exist," Thomas replied calmly. "Yet here we are." Sarah felt the tension building like electricity in the air before a storm. She could see the settlers' hands moving closer to their weapons, could sense the warriors preparing for battle. The healing power within her stirred restlessly, responding to the collective fear and anger radiating from both groups. "I'll give you one chance, Whitehorse," Sherman said, his voice dropping to a dangerous level. "Hand over the girl, and we'll ride out peaceful. Refuse, and we'll take her by force." "You are welcome to try," Thomas said with quiet dignity. "But I should warn you, this child is under the protection of powers greater than any you can imagine." Sherman laughed harshly. "Indian superstition won't stop bullets, Chief." What happened next unfolded with the terrible inevitability of fate. Sherman's hand moved to his gun, and in response, Thomas raised his rifle. The air itself seemed to hold its breath as two cultures prepared to clash over the fate of one frightened girl. But Sarah had felt something building within her during the confrontation, a pressure that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the ancient power flowing through her bloodline. The healing gift that had awakened that morning was transforming, revealing new aspects of itself in response to the threat. "Stop!" she cried, stepping forward into the space between the two groups. "Please, just stop." Her voice carried across the distance with unnatural force, and both sides froze as if struck by lightning. The pendant around her neck had begun to glow, and waves of energy rippled outward from her small form like heat shimmer rising from summer stones. Sherman's horse reared as the energy wave reached him, and several of the other mounts shied nervously. "What the hell?" he began, but his words were cut off as Sarah's power manifested in ways none of them had expected. The grass beneath her feet began to grow and spread, creating a verdant circle that expanded outward at impossible speed. Flowers bloomed in her footsteps, and the very air around her shimmered with life force so intense it was visible to the naked eye. Most remarkably, the anger and hostility that had filled the space between the two groups began to drain away, replaced by a profound sense of peace that seemed to emanate from the girl herself. "My God," one of the settlers whispered, his gun hand dropping to his side. "She's just a child." Sarah walked slowly toward the mounted men, her small form blazing with power that made the morning sun seem dim by comparison. As she moved, the wounds and ailments carried by both groups began to heal. An old injury in Thomas's leg that had troubled him for years simply vanished. One of the settlers, who had been suffering from a persistent cough, found his lungs clearing. For the first time in months, "I am Sarah Mitchell," she said, her young voice carrying the authority of ages. "I am the daughter of James and Mary Mitchell, the granddaughter of Rebecca White Dove. I am Comanche by blood and choice, and I will not be owned by any man." Sherman stared down at her, his face pale with shock. "You're just a child," he repeated. But his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I am a healer," Sarah corrected gently. "I am the bridge between two peoples who have forgotten how to live in peace. And I am telling you to leave this place and never return." The power radiating from her was unlike anything any of them had ever experienced. It wasn't threatening or violent, it was simply irresistible, like trying to argue with the sunrise, or demand that the river flow backward. The settlers found themselves turning their horses away from the camp without quite understanding why. "This isn't over," Sherman said, but his words lacked force. The healing energy that surrounded Sarah had touched something deep within him, awakening memories of a time when the world had seemed full of wonder rather than conflict. "Yes, it is," Sarah said with quiet certainty. "The old ways of taking what doesn't belong to you are ending. A new time is beginning, and those who cannot adapt will be left behind." As the settlers rode away, their departure marked by confusion rather than anger, Sarah felt the power that had surged through her begin to settle back into its normal channels. The glowing pendant against her chest cooled, and the supernatural vitality that had filled the air began to fade. But something fundamental had changed. The child who had cowered in Morrison's barn was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood her true nature and the responsibilities that came with it. Sarah Mitchell had become something new, a living bridge between two worlds, a healer whose power extended far beyond the physical realm. Thomas approached her slowly, his face filled with awe. "What you just did," he said quietly, "it was beyond anything the old stories spoke of. You didn't just heal their bodies, you touched their spirits. I felt their pain, Sarah said, her young voice heavy with newfound wisdom. All of it. The settlers' fear of losing their way of life, your people's anger at being pushed from their lands, the children on both sides who suffer because of adult hatred. I couldn't let it continue. Grandmother Mary emerged from the crowd of onlookers, her ancient eyes bright with tears. The prophecy speaks of one who will come to heal the great wound between the peoples, she said reverently. We thought it was metaphor, but you are the living fulfillment of the ancestors' vision. Sarah felt the weight of destiny settling on her shoulders like a ceremonial robe. What does that mean for me, for all of us? It means your real work is just beginning, Blue Sky Woman said, joining the group around Sarah. What you did today was instinctive, but there will be greater challenges ahead. You must learn to control your gift, to use it wisely and well. Over the following days, word of what had happened spread throughout the territory like wildfire. Stories grew in the telling. Some spoke of a white girl who had become a Comanche medicine woman, others of a young healer who could end conflicts with a touch. Settlers and Indians alike began to seek her out, drawn by reports of miraculous healings and the promise of peace. Sarah found herself at the center of a transformation that extended far beyond her personal journey. The camp became a pilgrimage site, with people traveling for days to seek her help. She healed everything from broken bones to broken hearts, from physical diseases to the spiritual wounds caused by years of hatred and misunderstanding. But perhaps most importantly, she began to heal the divide between the two cultures that had claimed her. Settlers who came expecting to find savage Indians instead discovered a people with deep wisdom and profound spirituality. Comanche, who had written off all white people as enemies, found themselves caring for settlers' children and sharing meals with former adversaries. You are creating something unprecedented, Thomas observed one evening as they watched a group of settler children playing with Comanche youngsters, their laughter echoing across the camp, a place where the old boundaries no longer matter. Sarah nodded, feeling the truth of his words in her bones. The spirits showed me something when I faced those men, she said. I saw what this land could become if people chose cooperation over conquest. I saw the future that's possible if we're brave enough to reach for it. The healing gift that had awakened within her was revealing new facets daily. She could sense the emotional wounds that divided communities, could feel the places where fear and prejudice had created barriers between people who should have been allies. And most remarkably, she was learning to heal those wounds as surely as she healed physical injuries. But Sarah was also learning that great power came with great responsibility. Each person she healed left her temporarily weakened, and the emotional burden of absorbing others' pain was taking its toll on her young spirit. There were nights when she lay awake, her body aching from the accumulated suffering she had taken into herself. The gift demands sacrifice, Grandmother Mary explained during one of their evening teaching sessions. That is why the spirits chose you, not because you were strong, but because you had already learned to endure suffering. You understand what it means to carry pain so that others might be free of it. Sarah touched the pendant at her throat, feeling its warmth pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. Will it always hurt like this? The pain will change, the old woman said gently. As you grow stronger, as you learn to channel the power more efficiently, the cost will become bearable. But it will never disappear entirely. That is the price of healing the world. As autumn approached, bringing with it the promise of winter and the challenges that would come with the changing seasons, Sarah realized that her transformation was far from complete. She had discovered her heritage, awakened her powers, and survived her first test. But the real work, the work of building bridges between two peoples, who had been taught to see each other as enemies, was just beginning. The scared little girl who had been chained in Morrison's barn was gone forever, replaced by someone who understood that healing wasn't just about mending broken bodies. It was about mending broken relationships, broken communities, and broken dreams. It was about showing people that the future could be different from the past, that love was stronger than fear, and that sometimes the most profound changes came from the most unlikely sources. Sarah Mitchell, granddaughter of White Dove, carrier of the ancient healing gift, had found her purpose. Now she had to find the strength to fulfill it. The first snow of winter arrived early that year, blanketing the camp in pristine white that muffled sound and transformed the familiar landscape into something ethereal and otherworldly. Sarah stood outside her teepee in the pre-dawn darkness, her breath forming silver clouds in the frigid air, as she prepared for another day of healing that would test the limits of her growing abilities. Word of the miracle worker had spread far beyond the Texas plains. People came from territories as distant as Colorado and New Mexico, traveling through dangerous weather and hostile territory for the chance to be touched by the girl who could heal with her hands. The steady stream of pilgrims had transformed the once peaceful camp into something resembling a frontier town, with temporary shelters springing up to accommodate the desperate and the hopeful. "You're up early again," Blue Sky Woman observed, emerging from her own lodge with a steaming cup of herbal tea. "Did you sleep at all last night?" Sarah accepted the warm drink gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around the clay vessel. "There's a family coming today from Arkansas. Their youngest son was trampled by a horse 3 months ago. He can't walk, can't speak. They've traveled through 2 blizzards to get here. And you already know you're going to heal him, Blue Sky," Woman said, reading the exhaustion in Sarah's young face. "Child, you cannot save everyone. The spirits did not give you this gift to destroy yourself with it." Sarah sipped the bitter tea, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. At 30 now, she had grown taller and stronger, but the constant drain of healing others was taking its toll. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her hands trembled slightly even when she wasn't actively using her powers. "If I don't help them, who will?" she asked quietly. "You've seen what happens when people lose hope. They turn to violence, to hatred, to anything that promises relief from their pain." It was true. The camp had become more than a place of healing. It had become a symbol of possibility in a world that seemed determined to tear itself apart. The ongoing conflict between settlers and native peoples had intensified over the past year, with massacres and retaliations creating an endless cycle of bloodshed. Only here, in this small pocket of peace, could members of both cultures find common ground. Thomas approached through the falling snow, his face grave with the weight of unwelcome news. "Sarah, we need to talk. There's been a development." She followed him to the council lodge, where Grandmother Mary waited with several tribal elders and a man Sarah didn't recognize, a weathered settler with kind eyes and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. "This is Judge Daniel Crawford from Fort Worth," Thomas explained. "He's brought news from the territorial capital." Judge Crawford stood respectfully as Sarah entered, his expression a mixture of awe and concern. "Miss Mitchell, I've heard remarkable stories about what you've accomplished here, but I'm afraid I bring troubling news." Sarah settled beside the fire, feeling the familiar tingle of power responding to the emotional tension in the room. "What kind of news?" "The territorial legislature is debating a bill that would classify any gathering of more than 50 Indians as a potential war party," Crawford said carefully. "Given the number of people who've been coming here, this camp could be declared illegal." The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. "They want to shut us down." "Some do," Crawford admitted. "There are those who see what you've built here as a threat to the established order. A place where Indians and settlers cooperate peacefully. Contradicts everything they've told themselves about why the violence is necessary." Grandmother Mary spoke up, her ancient voice carrying the weight of prophecy. The child of 2 worlds was always destined to face opposition from both. The spirits warned us this day would come. "There's more," Crawford continued reluctantly. "There are rumors that the military is planning to forcibly relocate all Comanche bands to reservations in Indian territory. If that happens, this camp will be broken up regardless of what the legislature decides. Sarah felt the healing power within her surge in response to her distress, causing the pendant at her throat to glow softly. "How long do we have?" "Weeks, perhaps a month," Crawford said. "I've been trying to delay the legislation, arguing that your work here represents a peaceful solution to the Indian problem. But there are powerful interests who profit from the continued conflict." The room fell silent as everyone absorbed the magnitude of the threat. Sarah closed her eyes, reaching out with her enhanced senses to feel the emotional landscape of the camp. She could sense the fear beginning to spread as word of the danger leaked out, could feel the hope that had sustained so many people starting to crack under the weight of impending doom. "What if we moved?" she asked suddenly. "Found somewhere beyond the reach of territorial law?" Thomas shook his head. "There is nowhere beyond their reach, little sister. The white man's law follows him wherever he goes, and it grows stronger every year." "Then we fight," one of the younger warriors said fiercely. "We show them what happens when they try to destroy what the spirits have blessed." "No," Sarah said firmly, her voice carrying an authority that surprised even herself. "Violence will only give them the excuse they need to destroy everything we've built. There has to be another way." Judge Crawford leaned forward, his eyes bright with possibility. "There might be. What if we could prove that your work here serves the interests of both peoples? What if we could demonstrate that healing and cooperation are more valuable than conquest and control?" "How do we do that?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "By taking your message beyond this camp," Crawford said. "By showing the world what you've accomplished here. I know people in Washington, members of Congress who might be willing to listen if they could see the miracles you perform." The idea of leaving the safety of the camp, of exposing herself to the wider world, filled Sarah with dread. Here, surrounded by people who understood and protected her, she could focus on healing. Out there, she would be vulnerable to those who saw her as a threat or a curiosity. "The spirits call their chosen ones to walk difficult paths, grandmother," Mary said gently. "You have always known this day would come, child. The question is whether you are ready to answer the call." Over the following days, Sarah wrestled with the decision while continuing her healing work. The steady stream of pilgrims continued unabated, each one carrying stories of suffering that touched her heart. She healed a Civil War veteran whose war wounds had never properly mended, a young mother whose grief over her dead child had driven her to the edge of madness, and countless others who had lost hope in everything except the possibility of a miracle. But with each healing, Sarah felt herself growing weaker. The power that flowed through her was limitless, but her human form was not. She was burning herself out trying to heal a world that seemed determined to create new wounds faster than she could mend the old ones. "You're killing yourself, Blue," Sky Woman said bluntly one evening as Sarah collapsed after a particularly difficult healing session. "The spirits gave you this gift to help people, not to destroy yourself with it." "I know," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "But how do I choose? How do I decide who deserves healing and who doesn't?" "By remembering that you are not responsible for healing everyone," Thomas said firmly. "You are responsible for showing people that healing is possible, that there is another way to live than in constant conflict." The crisis came to a head when a military patrol arrived at the camp, led by a young cavalry officer who seemed torn between his orders and his conscience. Lieutenant James Morrison, ironically, the nephew of the man who had once owned Sarah, dismounted with obvious reluctance. "I'm here under orders from Colonel Patterson," he announced to the assembled crowd. "This gathering is declared illegal under territorial law. You have 24 hours to disperse." Sarah stepped forward, her healing power automatically responding to the fear and anger radiating from the crowd. "Lieutenant Morrison, I remember you from when you were a child. You used to visit your uncle's farm." The young officer's face flushed with recognition and shame. Miss Mitchell, I want you to know that I don't agree with these orders. What you've done here is remarkable. But I have my duty. I understand duty, Sarah said gently, reaching out to touch his arm. Through that contact, she felt the conflict tearing at his spirit, the military training that demanded obedience warring with the moral certainty that what he was doing was wrong. There's another way, she continued, her voice carrying the power of absolute conviction. Come with me to Washington. Help me show the world what we've accomplished here. Help me prove that peace is possible. The healing energy that flowed from her touch was working on more than just physical ailments. Lieutenant Morrison's internal conflict was resolving itself, his conscience finally overcoming his training. I can't officially help you, he said quietly, but I can give you a head start. My patrol will be delayed by weather for at least a week. As he and his men rode away, Sarah felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. The choice was no longer whether to leave the camp, but how to ensure that the work they had begun would survive her absence. We'll maintain the healing lodge, Grandmother Mary promised. Others will come to learn what you have taught us. The gift may be yours alone, but the knowledge of how to use it can be shared. And we'll protect the camp until you return, Thomas added. The spirits will not allow this place to be destroyed while you carry their message to the world. Sarah spent her final night in the camp walking among the teepees, blessing each family and storing the memory of their faces in her heart. She had found her true family among the Comanche, had discovered her heritage and her purpose in their traditions. Now she had to leave them to save them. As dawn broke over the snow-covered plains, Sarah prepared for a journey that would take her far from everything she had come to love. But she carried with her more than just the healing power. She carried the hope of two peoples who had learned to see past their differences to the common humanity that bound them together. The scared little girl who had been chained in Morrison's barn was gone forever, replaced by a young woman who understood that true healing meant more than mending broken bodies. It meant mending broken systems, broken relationships, and broken dreams. It meant showing the world that there was another way to live, another way to be. Sarah Mitchell, bridge between worlds, was ready to carry that message to the very heart of the nation that had tried to destroy her. The greatest test of her powers and her courage lay ahead. The train to Washington thundered through the American heartland, its iron wheels beating a rhythm that seemed to echo the pounding of Sarah's heart. She pressed her face against the cold window glass, watching the landscape blur past in shades of brown and gray that spoke of a nation still healing from its own wounds. The Civil War had ended only 2 years earlier, and the scars were visible everywhere: abandoned farms, hastily rebuilt towns, and the hollow eyes of men who had seen too much death. Judge Crawford sat across from her in the private compartment. He had arranged, his weathered face creased with concern as he watched her struggle with the overwhelming sensory assault of the journey. Sarah's enhanced abilities, so useful in the controlled environment of the camp, were proving to be a liability in the crowded, emotionally charged atmosphere of the train. "The conductor's wife is dying of consumption," Sarah murmured, her hand pressed against her throat where the pendant pulsed with sympathetic pain. "The man in the next car lost his son at Gettysburg and hasn't slept properly since. There's a woman 3 cars back whose baby won't stop crying because she's too malnourished to produce milk." Crawford leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Sarah, you cannot heal everyone you encounter. If you try, you'll burn out before we reach the capital." "But they're suffering," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I can feel it all, their pain, their fear, their desperation. How do I just sit here and do nothing?" "By remembering that your mission is larger than any individual healing," Crawford replied. "What you're going to do in Washington could help thousands of people, maybe hundreds of thousands. Sometimes the greater good requires accepting smaller sacrifices." Sarah nodded, though the logic did nothing to ease the emotional burden. She closed her eyes and tried to center herself using the techniques Grandmother Mary had taught her, imagining her power as a flame that could be dimmed, but never extinguished. As the train carried them eastward through Missouri and Illinois, Crawford began preparing Sarah for the challenges that awaited them in the nation's capital. The men they would meet, congressmen, senators, military leaders, and government officials, lived in a world where power was measured in votes and violence, where compromise was seen as weakness and compassion as naivety. "You must understand," Crawford explained as they shared a simple meal in their compartment. "These are men who have built their careers on the assumption that conflict between whites and Indians is inevitable. Your very existence challenges that assumption." "What exactly do you want me to do?" Sarah asked, picking at the unfamiliar food. After months of the fresh, natural cuisine of the camp, the processed offerings of the dining car tasted like ash in her mouth. "Show them what peace looks like," Crawford said simply. "Demonstrate that healing is possible, that cooperation serves everyone's interests better than conquest. But most importantly, prove that you represent the future while they represent the past." The train pulled into Union Station on a gray February morning, and Sarah felt the full weight of the capital's power pressing down on her like a physical force. The massive stone buildings, the constant motion of carriages and pedestrians, the very air thick with ambition and scheming, it all felt like the opposite of everything she had come to love about the open plains. Their lodgings were modest but clean, a boarding house that catered to visiting dignitaries and their staff. Sarah's room was on the second floor, with a view of the street that allowed her to watch the endless parade of humanity that defined urban life. But what struck her most was the absence of the natural world. No grass, no trees, no open sky. Just stone and wood and the smoke from countless chimneys. "The first meeting is tomorrow," Crawford informed her as they settled into their rooms. "Senator Benjamin Harrison chairs the Committee on Indian Affairs. He's a reasonable man, but he's also a politician. He'll be looking for ways your proposals could benefit his constituents." That evening, Sarah stood before the mirror in her room, trying to reconcile the image staring back at her with the girl who had once been chained in Morrison's barn. She wore a simple blue dress that Crawford had purchased for her, her long hair braided in a style that honored her Comanche heritage, while remaining acceptable to white society. The pendant at her throat was hidden beneath the dress's collar, but she could feel its warmth against her skin. "I don't know if I can do this," she whispered to her reflection. "I don't know how to talk to these people." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah felt the familiar surge of power that had sustained her through every challenge. The spirits of her ancestors seemed to whisper encouragement, reminding her that she carried not just her own hopes but the dreams of everyone who had found refuge in the camp. The next morning brought her first real test. Senator Harrison's office was a monument to masculine authority: dark wood paneling, leather-bound books, and portraits of stern-faced men who had shaped the nation's destiny. Harrison himself was a compact man with intelligent eyes and a carefully groomed beard, the kind of person who measured his words as carefully as a pharmacist measured medicine. "Miss Mitchell," he said, rising from behind his massive desk, "Judge Crawford has told me remarkable things about your work in Texas. I must admit, I'm curious to meet the young woman who has supposedly solved the Indian problem." Sarah felt the subtle condescension in his tone, the assumption that she was somehow performing a trick that could be easily exposed. But she also sensed something else: genuine curiosity, and perhaps even hope that she might represent a real solution to a problem that had plagued his committee for years. "I haven't solved anything, Senator," Sarah replied quietly. "I've simply shown people that there's another way to live besides in constant conflict." "Judge Crawford claims you have unusual abilities," Harrison said, settling back into his chair. "Healing powers, he says. I hope you understand that such claims require extraordinary proof." Sarah glanced at Crawford, who nodded encouragingly. This was the moment they had prepared for, the demonstration that would either validate her mission or expose her as a fraud. "Do you have any injuries or ailments, Senator?" Sarah asked. "Anything that causes you pain or discomfort?" Harrison's expression grew guarded. "I've suffered from arthritis in my hands for several years. The Washington climate doesn't agree with old war wounds. May I?" Sarah asked, extending her hands toward him. Harrison hesitated, then slowly placed his gnarled hands in hers. The moment their skin made contact, Sarah felt the familiar flow of power, but this time it was different. Instead of the simple physical healing she had grown accustomed to, she found herself touching something deeper, the senator's memories, his fears, his genuine desire to serve his constituents, despite the political pressures that surrounded him. The arthritis dissolved under her touch, the swollen joints returning to their normal size and function. But more than that, Sarah felt Harrison's perspective shifting as her power worked on the emotional wounds that political life had inflicted on his spirit. "My God," Harrison whispered, flexing his fingers with amazement. "The pain is completely gone. But more than that, I feel different, clearer, somehow." Sarah released his hands, feeling the familiar exhaustion that followed any significant healing. "The body and spirit are connected, Senator. When you heal one, you often heal the other." Harrison stared at his hands for a long moment, then looked up at Sarah with an expression she had never seen on an adult's face when looking at her genuine respect. "What do you need from me?" he asked simply. Over the following days, Sarah found herself at the center of a whirlwind of meetings, demonstrations, and careful negotiations. Word of her abilities spread through the Capitol's corridors of power with the speed of wildfire, and soon she was healing cabinet members, generals, and even the occasional congressman who was willing to set aside his skepticism long enough to experience a miracle. But the real breakthrough came when she met President Andrew Johnson himself, the man who had inherited the presidency after Lincoln's assassination was carrying wounds that went far deeper than any physical ailment, the burden of trying to heal a nation still torn apart by civil war. "Miss Mitchell," Johnson said as they met in the Oval Office, "I've heard remarkable things about your work. Tell me, do you think the techniques you've used to bring peace between settlers and Indians could work on a national scale?" Sarah felt the weight of the question, understanding that her answer could shape the future of both the Indian Wars and the broader struggle for national unity. "Healing always begins with understanding, Mr. President. People fight because they're afraid of losing what they have, afraid of change, afraid of being forgotten. But when you show them that cooperation serves their interests better than conflict, when you prove that different doesn't mean dangerous, then peace becomes possible." "And you believe this is possible between the races?" Johnson asked. "Between North and South? Between the settled East and the frontier West? I believe it's not only possible, Mr. President, it's necessary. The alternative is endless cycles of violence that will destroy everything we claim to be fighting for." Johnson studied her for a long moment, then made a decision that would reshape American Indian policy for generations to come. "Miss Mitchell, I'm going to ask Congress to establish a new Department of Indian Reconciliation, with you as its director. Your job will be to implement your healing methods on a national scale, to show the country that there's another way forward." Sarah felt the magnitude of the opportunity and the responsibility settling on her shoulders. "I accept, Mr. President, but I'll need certain guarantees. The camps and settlements that have embraced peace must be protected. The military must be restrained from actions that would undermine the reconciliation process. And the treaties must be honored, not just signed and forgotten." "Done," Johnson said without hesitation. "You'll have my full support and the authority to make the changes necessary to fulfill your mission." As Sarah left the White House that evening, she felt the weight of history pressing down on her. The scared little girl who had been chained in Morrison's barn was about to become one of the most powerful women in America, tasked with healing wounds that had been festering since the first Europeans set foot on the continent. But she also felt the presence of those who had guided her to this moment: Thomas, Grandmother Mary, Blue Sky Woman, and all the others who had shown her what was possible when people chose cooperation over conquest. She was no longer just Sarah Mitchell, the orphaned child. She was Sarah Mitchell, the bridge between worlds, the healer who would teach a nation how to live in peace. The real work was just beginning, but for the first time since leaving the camp, Sarah felt truly hopeful about the future. She had the power of the federal government behind her, the respect of the nation's leaders, and most importantly, the ancient wisdom of her people flowing through her veins. The wounded Comanche chief, who had seen something special in a starving girl chained in a barn, had been right. She was destined for something greater than anyone had imagined. Now it was time to prove that his faith in her had been justified. The assassination attempt came on a rainy Tuesday morning in April, as Sarah walked from her temporary office in the War Department to a meeting with territorial governors. The would-be killer was a grizzled former cavalry officer named Marcus Thompson, whose hatred of Indians had been festering since his unit was decimated in a Comanche raid 5 years earlier. Sarah sensed the danger before she saw it: a spike of violent intent that cut through the normal emotional background of the busy Washington street like a blade through silk. She turned just as Thompson raised his pistol, his face twisted with rage and grief that had curdled into something poisonous. "You Indian-loving witch!" he screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger. "You're destroying everything we fought." Time seemed to slow as Sarah reached out with her power, not to heal but to understand. In that split second before the gun fired, she felt the full weight of Thompson's pain, the friends he had lost, the nightmares that plagued his sleep, the fear that his sacrifices had been meaningless. His hatred wasn't born from evil but from a broken heart that had never been allowed to heal. The bullet left the gun, but instead of striking Sarah, it veered wide, embedding itself harmlessly in a nearby building. Thompson's arm had jerked at the last moment, his conscience finally overcoming his rage as Sarah's power touched his wounded spirit. "I'm sorry," he whispered, dropping the weapon and falling to his knees. "I'm so sorry. I just ... I couldn't let them die for nothing." Sarah knelt beside him in the muddy street, ignoring the shouts of alarm from passers-by and the approaching thunder of police boots. She placed her hands on Thompson's shoulders, feeling the years of accumulated trauma that had driven him to this desperate act. "They didn't die for nothing," she said softly, her healing power flowing into him like warm honey. "They died protecting their friends, their beliefs, their way of life. That has meaning, even if the war itself was wrong." As her power worked on his damaged psyche, Thompson's rigid posture began to soften. The lines of perpetual anger on his face smoothed away, replaced by the kind of peace he hadn't known since before the war. "I saw you in the papers," he said, his voice breaking. "Saw how you were helping Indians, making peace with them. And all I could think about was Jimmy Morrison and Pete Collins, and all the good men who died fighting those same people. It felt like you were spitting on their graves. I'm honoring their sacrifice by making sure no one else has to die the way they did," Sarah replied, her own eyes filling with tears. "The greatest tribute to their memory is ensuring that their children won't have to fight the same battles." The incident made headlines across the nation, but not in the way Sarah's enemies had hoped. Instead of discrediting her mission, Thompson's transformation became a powerful symbol of her ability to heal even the deepest wounds. The image of the young woman kneeling in the street, comforting the man who had tried to kill her, captured the imagination of a war-weary nation. But the attack also revealed the depth of opposition to her work. Within hours of the incident, Sarah received word that several territorial governors had withdrawn their support for the reconciliation program. Military leaders who had initially been willing to cooperate began raising concerns about premature peace initiatives that might encourage Indian aggression. They're organizing against you," Judge Crawford warned during an emergency meeting that evening. "Senator Robert Williams from Kansas is calling for congressional hearings to investigate your methods. He's claiming you're using some kind of mesmerism or witchcraft to manipulate government officials." Sarah felt the familiar weight of persecution settling on her shoulders. "Let them investigate. I have nothing to hide." "It's not about what you're hiding," Crawford replied grimly. "It's about what they can make people believe." Williams has powerful allies, men who profit from the Indian wars, who see your peace initiatives as threats to their business interests. The hearings began 3 weeks later in a packed Senate chamber, with Sarah seated at a small table facing a panel of skeptical legislators. Senator Williams, a tall man with cold eyes and the bearing of someone who had never doubted his own righteousness, led the questioning with the skill of a prosecutor. "Miss Mitchell," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "you claim to possess supernatural healing abilities. Are you asking the American people to base their policy decisions on magic?" Sarah felt the hostility radiating from the packed gallery, the mixture of curiosity and suspicion that had become familiar over the past months. "I'm asking them to base their decisions on results, Senator. The settlements that have embraced reconciliation have seen dramatic reductions in violence. Families who were once enemies now work together for their mutual benefit. And you achieve these results through what means?" Williams pressed. "Witnesses have described you performing miraculous healings, touching people, and somehow changing their fundamental nature. Are you claiming divine authority?" "I'm claiming nothing more than the ability to help people heal from the wounds that drive them to violence," Sarah replied calmly. "Whether that comes from divine intervention or natural, talent is less important than the fact that it works." Williams leaned forward, his expression predatory. "Miss Mitchell, is it true that you were raised by Comanche Indians after being purchased from a white settler?" The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had known this moment would come, but the public exposure of her origin still felt like being stripped naked in front of the world. "Yes," she said quietly. "I was adopted by the Comanche after being rescued from slavery." "Slavery?" Williams's voice rose with theatrical outrage. "You were legally bound to a settler who was training you for domestic work. That's hardly slavery." "I was chained in a barn, Senator. I was beaten regularly, starved, and treated as property to be bought and sold. If that's not slavery, then words have no meaning." The admission sent a ripple of shock through the chamber. Sarah's supporters had carefully avoided discussing the details of her background, focusing instead on her achievements. But now the truth was laid bare. The revered peace negotiator was herself a victim of the very system she was trying to reform. "And in gratitude for your rescue," Williams continued, "you adopted the religious practices and cultural beliefs of these Indians. Isn't it true that you participate in pagan ceremonies and claim to receive visions from Indian spirits?" Sarah felt her temper flare, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I practice the spiritual traditions of my adopted people, just as any grateful child would honor their parents' beliefs. Those traditions taught me the value of all life, the importance of harmony between different peoples, and the power of healing over hatred. Pagan traditions that have no place in a Christian nation," Williams shot back. "Miss Mitchell, how can the American people trust their Indian policy to someone who has more loyalty to savage tribes than to the civilization that created her?" The word savage hung in the air like a slap. Sarah felt the healing power within her respond to the insult, causing the pendant beneath her dress to grow warm against her skin. But instead of anger, she felt a deep sadness for the fear and ignorance that drove men like Williams to such hatred. "Senator," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority that silenced the murmurs in the gallery, "I have lived among both peoples. I have seen the best and worst of both cultures. What I learned is that there are no savages, only people who have been taught to fear what they don't understand." She stood, her slight figure somehow commanding the attention of the entire chamber. "You want to know where my loyalty lies? It lies with the children on both sides who are growing up in a world where their parents' hatred defines their future. It lies with the mothers who bury their sons in wars that serve no purpose except to perpetuate more wars. It lies with the fathers who teach their children to kill instead of to heal." The power within her was growing stronger, responding to the emotional intensity of the moment. Several people in the gallery began to weep as her words touched something deep within their spirits. "I have seen what peace looks like," Sarah continued, her voice gaining strength. "I have watched former enemies become friends, watched children play together regardless of the color of their skin, watched communities thrive when they choose cooperation over conquest. And I have seen the alternative, the endless cycle of violence that destroys everything it touches." She turned to face the gallery, her eyes blazing with the fire of absolute conviction. "You can investigate my methods, question my beliefs, and challenge my authority, but you cannot argue with the results. The reconciliation program has saved hundreds of lives and prevented countless acts of violence. It has shown the world that there is another way forward, a path that honors both justice and mercy." The chamber erupted in applause, but Sarah barely heard it. She was looking directly at Senator Williams, seeing past his political calculations to the wounded soul beneath. He had lost his own son in an Indian raid, she realized, and his hatred was born from the same grief that had driven Marcus Thompson to attempt murder. "Senator Williams," she said quietly, her voice somehow carrying over the noise of the crowd, "I'm sorry for your loss. But destroying the peace won't bring your son back. It will only ensure that other fathers suffer the same loss." For a moment, Williams's composed facade cracked, revealing the pain he had hidden behind years of political maneuvering. But then his training reasserted itself, and he banged his gavel for order. "This hearing is adjourned," he announced, his voice thick with emotion. "The committee will render its decision after deliberating on the testimony presented." As Sarah left the chamber, she felt the familiar exhaustion that followed any significant use of her power. But she also felt something else, a sense that the tide was turning, that the seeds of understanding she had planted were beginning to take root in even the most hostile soil. The real battle for the soul of America was just beginning. But Sarah Mitchell, the girl who had been chained in a barn and transformed into a bridge between worlds, was ready to fight for the future she had seen in her visions. The wounded Comanche chief who had recognized her destiny had been right. She was meant for something greater than anyone had imagined. Now it was time to prove that his faith in her had been justified. One heart at a time. The telegram arrived. On a gray September morning, its words stark and terrible in their simplicity. "Camp attacked. Thomas wounded. Come home immediately. Blue Sky Woman." Sarah's hands trembled as she read the message again, hoping the words would somehow change, that the nightmare she had dreaded would prove to be a mistake. Judge Crawford found her in her office an hour later, staring out the window at the bustling Washington streets, while the untouched telegram lay crumpled on her desk. The congressional hearings had ended the previous month with a narrow victory for the reconciliation program, but the cost had been enormous. Sarah's health was deteriorating under the constant stress, and the political battles had taken a toll on her spirit that no amount of healing power could repair. "Sarah," Crawford said gently, "I heard about the telegram. I'm sorry." She turned to face him, her eyes hollow with exhaustion and grief. "They waited until I was away," she whispered. "They waited until I couldn't protect them." "Who attacked the camp?" "Colonel Patterson's cavalry unit, according to the report. They claim they were responding to intelligence about hostile Indian activity, but we both know the truth." Sarah's voice was bitter with the taste of betrayal. "While I was in Washington defending the program, they were destroying everything we built." Crawford moved to her side, his weathered face creased with concern. The president has already ordered an investigation. Patterson will be held accountable for his actions. Accountable? Sarah laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. 14 people are dead, Crawford. 14 people who trusted me to protect them while I played politics with their lives. What kind of accountability balances that scale? The journey back to Texas was a blur of grief and self-recrimination. Sarah traveled alone, refusing Crawford's offer of companionship, needing the solitude to process the magnitude of her failure. The healing power that had sustained her through every previous crisis felt diminished. Overwhelmed by the weight of her own guilt, the landscape outside the train window was achingly familiar, the endless expanse of prairie grass, the distant mountains, the vast sky that had once seemed full of infinite possibility. But now it felt like a rebuke, a reminder of the peace she had abandoned in pursuit of political solutions that had proven as fragile as morning mist. The remnants of the camp were worse than she had imagined. Where once there had been a thriving community of hope and healing, now there were only charred ruins and scattered belongings. The great council lodge where she had first learned about her heritage was a blackened skeleton of poles and ash. The healing lodge where she had discovered her power was nothing more than a depression in the earth, marked by melted medicinal implements. Sarah found the survivors, gathered in a temporary camp 2 miles from the original site, their faces bearing the hollow look of people who had lost everything but their lives. Blue Sky Woman rose from beside a cooking fire as Sarah approached, her eyes red with weeping, but her spine straight with the dignity that had never left her. "Little sister," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "you came." Sarah fell into her arms, finally allowing the tears she had held back during the long journey to flow freely. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here. I should have protected you." "You were where the spirits called you to be," Blue Sky Woman replied firmly. "The fault lies with those who chose violence over peace, not with you." Thomas lay in one of the temporary shelters, his body broken but his spirit undefeated. The cavalry attack had caught him while he was trying to evacuate the children, and a saber blow had shattered his left leg and opened a gash across his chest that had nearly killed him. But his eyes still held the same warmth that had seen potential in a starving girl chained in a barn. "Sarah," he whispered as she knelt beside his makeshift bed, "I knew you would come." She placed her hands on his wounds, feeling the familiar flow of healing power, but something was different. The energy felt muted, constrained, as if her own emotional wounds were interfering with her ability to heal others. Thomas's injuries began to mend, but slowly, incompletely, requiring far more effort than such healing should have demanded. "My power," she said in confusion. "It's not working properly." Thomas caught her hands in his grip surprisingly strong. "Despite his injuries, the healing gift is connected to the healer's spirit," he said gently. "When your heart is wounded, your power is wounded too. You must heal yourself before you can heal others." Grandmother Mary confirmed Thomas's diagnosis when Sarah sought her out later that evening. The ancient woman had survived the attack by virtue of her age. Even Patterson's soldiers had balked at killing a woman who was clearly approaching her final years. But the destruction of the camp had aged her visibly, adding new lines to her weathered face and a tremor to her hands that spoke of profound grief. "You carry the weight of failure," Grandmother Mary observed as they sat together beside the small fire that provided the only warmth in the devastated camp. "But failure is not the same as defeat, child. Sometimes the spirits break us down so they can rebuild us stronger." 14 people died because I wasn't here," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How is that not defeat?" "Because their deaths were not meaningless," the old woman replied. "The attack on our camp has shown the world the true nature of those who oppose peace. The newspapers are full of outrage about Patterson's actions. Politicians who once supported military solutions are now calling for investigations. Your enemies have revealed themselves to be the monsters they always were. Sarah stared into the flames, seeing not comfort, but accusation in their dancing light. I could have prevented it. If I had stayed, if I had protected them, then you would have died with them, and the reconciliation program would have died too, Grandmother Mary said bluntly. The spirits did not give you the healing gift so you could be a martyr, Sarah. They gave it to you so you could be a bridge between worlds, a living symbol of what is possible when people choose love over fear. Over the following days, Sarah threw herself into the work of helping the survivors, but her diminished power made every healing a struggle. Simple injuries that once would have mended at her touch now required hours of concentrated effort. The emotional wounds of the attack victims proved even more resistant to her abilities. Their trauma too deep and fresh for her compromised gift to reach. The breaking point came when she tried to heal a young boy named Running Bear, Thomas's nephew, who had been struck in the head during the attack. The child lay unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular, while his mother kept vigil beside him with the desperate intensity of a woman who had already lost too much. Sarah placed her hands on the boy's head, reaching deep into her power reserves to find the energy needed for such a complex healing. But instead of the usual flow of warm energy, she felt only a trickle of power, barely enough to ease the child's breathing, but nowhere near sufficient to repair the damage to his brain. I can't, she whispered, pulling her hands away in defeat. I can't heal him. The boy's mother looked up with eyes that held no accusation, only sorrow. You have given us so much already, she said softly. No one can carry the weight of the world alone. That night, Sarah walked alone to the site of the original camp, her feet carrying her to the place where the healing lodge had stood. Ground was still scarred with ash and debris, but something drew her to sit in the center of the ruins, where the sacred fire had once burned. As she sat in the darkness, surrounded by the ghosts of her failures, Sarah felt something shift within her chest. The guilt and self-recrimination that had been poisoning her power began to dissolve, replaced by a deeper understanding of her role in the larger pattern of events. She had not failed, she had been tested. The destruction of the camp was not a defeat but a catalyst, a moment that would force the nation to confront the consequences of choosing violence over peace. The healing power that had sustained her was not diminished but transformed, preparing her for challenges she had not yet imagined. The pendant at her throat began to glow softly, and Sarah felt the presence of her ancestors gathering around her like a protective circle. White Dove, her grandmother, seemed to whisper words of encouragement that carried across the generations. The spirits of the 14 who had died in the attack appeared not as accusers but as guides, their sacrifice giving her the strength to continue. As dawn broke over the devastated camp, Sarah rose from her vigil with renewed purpose. She walked back to the survivors' camp, her steps steady with newfound resolve. Thomas was awake when she reached his shelter, his eyes bright with the knowledge that something fundamental had changed. You feel it too, he said simply. The power is returning, Sarah confirmed. But it's different now. Stronger, but also more focused. I think I understand what I'm meant to do. She placed her hands on Running Bear's head once more, and this time the healing energy flowed freely, repairing the damage to his brain and bringing color back to his pale cheeks. The boy's eyes fluttered open, and he smiled up at his mother with the innocent joy of a child who had been given a second chance at life. But Sarah knew that individual healings, miraculous as they might be, were no longer enough. The attack on the camp had revealed the true nature of the conflict, not just between settlers and Indians, but between two visions of America's future. One based on domination and exclusion, the other on cooperation and inclusion. The wounded Comanche chief who had seen her potential in a barn 3 years ago had been right about her destiny. But even he had not imagined the scope of the transformation she would be called to lead. The girl who had been chained and broken had become the woman who would either heal a nation or watch it tear itself apart. The real battle for America's soul was about to begin. And Sarah Mitchell, bridge between worlds, was finally ready to fight it with the full power of her heritage. Her training, and her unshakable belief that love was stronger than hatred. The spirits had tested her and found her worthy. Now it was time to prove that their faith in her had been justified. 5 years later, Sarah stood on the steps of the newly constructed National Center for Reconciliation, watching as representatives from 47 different tribes gathered. Alongside government officials, military leaders, and settlers from across the continent. The building behind her, a magnificent structure that blended traditional Native American architecture with modern engineering, represented something unprecedented in American history, a place where two peoples had chosen to build their future together rather than apart. The attack on the camp had indeed been a catalyst, but not in the way Colonel Patterson had intended. The national outrage that followed his brutal assault had swept away the political opposition to Sarah's reconciliation program, replacing it with a groundswell of support for genuine peace. Patterson himself had been court-martialed and imprisoned, his career destroyed by the very violence he had thought would secure his legacy. "Are you ready for this?" asked Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, Sarah's deputy director and closest advisor. The young woman had been one of the first graduates of the reconciliation program's educational initiatives, a former settler's daughter who had learned to speak 4 native languages and had dedicated her life to bridging cultural divides. Sarah touched the pendant at her throat, feeling its familiar warmth pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat. At 18, she had grown into the role that destiny had thrust upon her, but she had never lost the quiet humility that had first drawn Thomas to her. Her power had evolved far beyond simple healing. She could now touch the spiritual wounds that divided entire communities, could feel the collective pain of peoples and guide them toward understanding. "I've been ready for this my entire life," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone who had learned to trust both her abilities and her instincts. The ceremony about to begin would formally establish the Treaty of Eternal Peace, a document that would govern relations between the United States government and all Native peoples. But more than that, it would create a new model for how different cultures could coexist without one dominating the other. Thomas emerged from the building, walking with only a slight limp from his old injuries. The years had added silver to his hair and lines to his face, but his eyes still held the same warmth that had seen potential in a starving girl chained in a barn. He had become Sarah's most trusted advisor, helping her navigate the complex politics of tribal leadership while keeping her connected to the spiritual traditions that gave her power its meaning. "The delegates are assembled," he reported. "Both sides are ready to begin." Sarah nodded, but her attention was drawn to a familiar figure approaching through the crowd. Jacob Morrison, the man who had once owned her, walked slowly up the steps, his face bearing the weight of years and the burden of guilt that had transformed him from a cruel master into an advocate for justice. "Sarah," he said, his voice hoarse with emotion, I wanted to thank you for what you did for my nephew James, for what you've done for all of us." Lieutenant James Morrison had indeed become one of Sarah's most effective allies, using his military connections to protect the reconciliation settlements, while his uncle worked to make amends for his past cruelty. The man who had once chained a child in his barn now ran a school for orphaned children of all backgrounds, teaching them the lessons of cooperation and understanding that Sarah had embodied. "We all deserve the chance to become better than we were," Sarah said gently, placing her hand on Morrison's shoulder. Through that touch, she felt the genuine remorse and dedication that had replaced his former bitterness. "The spirits judge us not by our past failures but by our present choices." As Morrison walked away, Sarah felt the familiar surge of power that came when she was about to undertake something of monumental importance. The pendant at her throat began to glow softly, and she could sense the spiritual energy of everyone Gathered in the plaza thousands of people whose lives had been touched by the reconciliation program, whose children would grow up in a world where difference was celebrated rather than feared. The ceremony began with traditional songs from multiple tribes, their voices blending in harmonies that spoke of ancient wisdom and enduring hope. Sarah listened to the music with her enhanced senses, feeling the emotional resonance of each note as it washed over the assembled crowd. The songs were followed by speeches from tribal leaders, government officials, and settlers who had experienced the transformation that peace could bring. But it was Sarah's address that everyone had come to hear. As she approached the podium, the crowd fell silent, their collective attention focused on the young woman who had become the living symbol of what America could become when it chose love over fear. 7 years ago, Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly across the plaza, I was a piece of property, chained in a barn, and treated as less than human. I was rescued by a wounded Comanche war chief who saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself, the potential to become a bridge between two worlds that had been taught to see each other as enemies. She paused, allowing her words to sink in before continuing. That rescue changed my life, but it did more than that. It showed me that healing is possible, that forgiveness is stronger than hatred, and that the greatest strength comes not from conquest, but from the courage to see the humanity in those we've been taught to despise. The crowd was completely silent, now hanging on every word as Sarah's power worked its subtle magic on their hearts and minds. She could feel the barriers of prejudice and fear beginning to dissolve, replaced by something far more powerful: hope. The treaty we signed today is not just a document, Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger with each sentence. It is a promise that we will choose cooperation over conflict, understanding over ignorance, and love over fear. It is a promise that our children will inherit a world where the color of their skin or the culture of their ancestors will never determine their worth or limit their possibilities. She gestured toward the mixed crowd of settlers and Native Americans, their faces reflecting the same hope that blazed in her own heart. Look around you. See the faces of people who were once enemies, now standing together as friends. See the children playing without regard for the boundaries their parents once considered insurmountable. This is not just a dream, it is a reality we have already begun to create. The power flowing through her was unlike anything she had ever experienced. It wasn't the focused healing energy she had used to mend broken bones or cure diseases. This was something far greater, the power to heal the wounds of history itself, to transform the very soul of a nation. The spirits of my ancestors whisper to me of a time when all peoples lived in harmony with each other and with the earth that sustains us, Sarah said, her voice now carrying the authority of ages. That time is not in the past, it is in the future we will build together. But it requires something from each of us. It requires the courage to let go of old hatreds, the wisdom to see past our differences to our common humanity, and the faith to believe that a better world is possible. As she spoke, something miraculous began to happen. The pendant at her throat blazed with light that was visible even in the afternoon sun, and waves of healing energy pulsed outward from her small form. Everyone in the plaza felt it, the lifting of burdens they had carried for generations, the healing of wounds they had forgotten they possessed, the sudden awareness that they were all part of something larger and more beautiful than any individual culture or tradition. Old men who had fought in the Indian wars found themselves weeping as decades of hatred simply evaporated from their hearts. Native American leaders who had counseled eternal resistance against white expansion felt their anger transforming into something more constructive, a determination to build rather than destroy. Children who had been raised on stories of mutual enmity looked at each other with new eyes, seeing friends where they had been taught to see enemies. The wounded Comanche chief who saved me from slavery knew something that took me years to understand, Sarah concluded, her voice now carrying the weight of absolute truth. He knew that healing is not just about mending what is broken, it is about creating something new and better than what came before. Today, we are not just ending a war. We are beginning a new chapter in the story of what it means to be human. The treaty signing that followed was more than a political ceremony. It was a spiritual transformation that would reshape the American continent for generations to come. As each leader stepped forward to add their signature to the document, Sarah felt the power of the moment, binding them together in ways that went far beyond legal obligations. In the years that followed, the Treaty of Eternal Peace would become a model for peaceful coexistence that would be studied and emulated around the world. The reconciliation centers that spread across the continent would become places where different cultures could meet, learn from each other, and build new traditions that honored both their differences and their shared humanity. Sarah herself would continue to serve as the bridge between worlds, her healing power evolving to meet new challenges as they arose. She would establish schools that taught the wisdom of both cultures, create healing centers that combine traditional medicine with modern techniques, and train a new generation of leaders who understood that true strength came from unity rather than division. But perhaps her greatest achievement was the simple fact that she had survived, that the frightened child who had been chained in Morrison's barn had grown into a woman who could heal not just individuals but entire civilizations. The wounded Comanche chief who had seen her potential had been right about her destiny, though even he had not imagined the scope of the transformation she would bring about. As the ceremony concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Sarah felt the presence of those who had guided her journey. Thomas, whose wisdom had shaped her understanding; Grandmother Mary, whose teachings had awakened her power; Blue Sky Woman, whose love had shown her what family truly meant; and countless others who had believed in the possibility of peace when the world seemed determined to choose war. The sacred fire of unity that had been lit in her heart that day in Morrison's barn now blazed as a beacon for all humanity. The girl who had been bought and sold like property had become the woman who would help reshape the very concept of what it meant to be free. The wounded had become the healer, the enslaved had become the liberator, and the bridge between worlds had become the foundation for a future where all peoples could stand together as one. The spirits had chosen well, and their faith in Sarah Mitchell, granddaughter of White Dove, daughter of the Comanche, healer of nations, had been justified in ways that would echo through eternity. The sacred healing powers that had awakened in a desperate child had grown into something that could heal not just bodies, but the very soul of a civilization. And in the years to come, when children of all backgrounds played together in the shadow of the reconciliation centers, when former enemies worked side by side to build a better world, when the dream of true equality finally became reality, they would remember the wounded Comanche chief who had dared to buy a starving girl from a barn and the sacred gift that had transformed them all. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.